In the spring of 2020, a man named Colt Reimer stood in his grandmother's kitchen in Platte County, Nebraska, holding a mason jar the way you hold a bird with a broken wing. The jar contained a paste the color of old ivory, alive in the way that live things are alive before anyone thinks to say so. And it had been fermenting on that counter, or one very like it, since 1953. A county extension specialist named Dr. Phil Graydon had driven out to Platte County 2 weeks before the bakeries shuttered, part of a university outreach initiative, to document what he called residential food heritage assets. He had been polite. He had been thorough. He had set his tablet on the kitchen table, swiped to a form, and told Colt that what he was looking at was a biological artifact of primarily sentimental value that could not be reliably scaled, certified, or commercialized under any regulatory framework he was aware of. He said the commercial sourdough market was dominated by industrial starters maintained in climate-controlled facilities with standardized microbial profiles. He said the jar was charming. He said it with the patient, warm finality of a man who had delivered this particular verdict many times before and expected it to settle the matter without argument. Colt did not argue. He set the jar back on the counter beside the window where the morning light came in from the east and thanked Dr. Graydon for his time. 4 years later, in the early months of 2024, a single batch of starter culture descending from that mason jar shipped to 1,432 home bakers across 31 states. The waiting list had been open for 6 days. The waiting list had closed in 4. Let me tell you how that happened. Because the number matters less than what it took to produce it. And what it took is a story about 2 kinds of knowing that cannot easily be taught to each other. Colt Reimer was 31 years old in 2020 and known in Platte County for 2 things. The first was a patience that his high school teachers had mistaken for slowness. The second was a sourdough loaf that could make people go quiet at a table. He was lean with the kind of economical build that farm work produces over years rather than weeks, and he drove a 2004 pickup with a cracked dash and a driver's seat that had long since conformed to his particular posture. He had spent 4 years studying food science at the University of Nebraska, come home with a degree and a job offer from a large regional bakery operation in Omaha, and then spent 3 years watching that bakery run starter cultures that were renewed from commercial packets every 6 weeks because consistency and cost per loaf mattered more than anything a microbiologist with a clipboard couldn't measure. He had watched the production manager, a pleasant man with a process engineering certificate, framed on his office wall, override a baker's instinct about fermentation time on the grounds that the proof schedule had been optimized for throughput. The bread that came out was fine. It was always fine. It tasted like bread that had been designed to taste like bread, and Colt found he could not stop thinking about the difference between a thing designed to seem like itself and a thing that simply was itself. He had quit in February of 2020, the kind of quit that feels like returning to something rather than leaving it, and driven back to Platte County to help his grandmother, Vera, who was 82 years old and moving more slowly than she had a year before. He arrived on a Thursday. By Saturday, he was sleeping in his childhood room, feeding the animals before breakfast, and learning to watch his grandmother's hands in the kitchen the way he had not thought to watch them when he was young. Vera Reimer was known in the county for 2 things as well. The first was a directness that strangers sometimes took for rudeness. The second was a sourdough culture she called simply the dough, which she had received as a portion from her own mother, a German immigrant named Hilda, who had crossed the Missouri River with a crock of starter tucked inside a flour sack in the autumn of 1948. Hilda had brought the culture from a village in Saxony where it had been maintained in her family's kitchen since before anyone could document. She had known it would not survive a generation without passing it forward, and she had pressed a portion on Vera on the morning of Vera's wedding in 1957, with the same unhurried certainty with which she did everything. She said it needed to be fed before sunrise and after dark, and that it would tell you when it was ready if you learned its smell. The culture had survived 2 kitchen fires, one prolonged drought during which Vera had fed it nothing but rye flour and well water, and the death of the original crock, which had shattered in 1971 and been replaced with a series of mason jars that Vera washed in cold water only, no soap, because she had learned from her mother that soap killed what soap could not see. Vera had pressed portions on 14 neighbors over the years. She had taught 4 of them how to bake with it. She had never written the feeding schedule down because she said the feeding schedule was not a schedule, but a conversation, and you could not write down a conversation in advance. Dr. Phil Graydon arrived on a Tuesday in March, drove a white university pickup, wore clean boots that had not touched mud, and carried a tablet loaded with a survey instrument developed for the university's extension service. He was 47, had a doctorate in food microbiology from Iowa State, and was not a bad man. He was, in fact, an earnest one, the kind of earnestness that comes from believing that rigor and care are the same thing, and from having spent a career inside institutions where they often are. He believed in food safety. He believed in the regulatory frameworks that protected consumers from the careless and the corner-cutting. He believed that the commercial sourdough market had been thoroughly studied and that the place for heritage cultures was a museum archive, not a shipping box, because the archive was where you preserved things safely, and a shipping box was where you took on liability. You could not back up with a spec sheet. He sat across from Vera's kitchen table, looked at the jar on the counter, and asked Colt whether he had any documentation of the culture's microbial composition. Colt said he did not. Dr. Graydon nodded, made a note on his tablet. He said that without a characterized microbial profile, meaning a formal speciation of the wild yeast and lactobacillus strains present in the culture, no commercial claim could be made about the starter's performance or safety. He said that the sourdough market had consolidated around 3 or 4 major starter producers whose products were shelf-stable, reproducible, and certified to a standard that consumers and regulators could evaluate. He said this was not a personal judgment. He said the jar was, and here he paused and chose the word carefully, charming. Vera did not answer. She refilled his coffee from the percolator on the stove, set the pot back, and returned to the window where she had been watching a pair of grackles in the yard with the focused patience of a woman who had learned that most conversations resolve themselves if you let them run. Colt said they were not interested in what the market had consolidated around. Dr. Graydon smiled patiently, the smile of a man who had said what he came to say, and understood that his audience was not ready to hear it. He said that was understandable, that sentiment had real value, and that he respected it, and that perhaps a local farmer's market or a small cottage bakery registration might be an appropriate outlet. He said cottage-scale production would limit sales to direct in-person transactions within the state, which would keep the liability contained and the regulatory exposure manageable. He said the university had resources for small food entrepreneurs and that Colt was welcome to reach out. He left a pamphlet about cottage food laws on the table beside his empty coffee cup and drove back down the gravel road in his clean white pickup. Neither Colt nor Vera watched him go. Colt picked up the pamphlet, read it, and set it on the windowsill. Vera said nothing. After a moment, she said the coffee needed to be a little stronger and went to the percolator. That was the first time Dr. Graydon called the culture a sentimental artifact. It would not be the last. Let me tell you what was in that jar, because sentiment is not what kept it alive for 72 years. A sourdough starter is not yeast in the way that a packet of commercial yeast is yeast. A commercial yeast packet contains a single, isolated strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, bred for reliability, predictability, and a consistent rise in industrial conditions. It is a monoculture, one organism selected for one set of behaviors, designed to perform identically in a bakery in Omaha, and a bakery in Portland, and a bakery in any temperature-controlled facility where the flour and water and proofing conditions have been standardized to receive it. It rises fast. It rises the same every time. It tastes like itself, which is to say it tastes like yeast, reliably, without complexity or variation. A wild sourdough starter contains a community, dozens of wild yeast strains, and as many as 40 distinct species of lactobacillus bacteria, all of them interacting in a web of fermentation chemistry that shifts and self-corrects based on the flour it is fed, the temperature of the room, the mineral composition of the water, and the ambient microflora of the kitchen where it lives. The lactobacillus species are the organisms that produce lactic and acetic acid as they metabolize flour, and it is the balance between those two acids that gives wild sourdough its flavor. A culture weighted toward lactic acid production tastes mild, slightly yogurtic, with a softness to the crumb. A culture weighted toward acetic acid tastes sharp and complex, with a crust that carries a long finish. The ratio is not set by the baker. It is set by the community, and the community is set by the conditions it lives inside. Each of those variables presses on the community, and the community adapts, selecting for strains that can tolerate the local conditions, letting the others fall away. This is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism of natural selection operating inside a mason jar on a kitchen counter in Platte County, Nebraska. Vera's starter had been selected by that kitchen for more than 60 years. It had been selected by Nebraska well water, which carries a mineral profile specific to the aquifer beneath the county, and by the red winter wheat grown within 30 miles of that counter, and by the particular humidity of a river-bottom farmhouse in August and the dry cold of the same house in January. It had been selected by the ambient bacteria of a kitchen where 2 generations of women had cured pork and pickled vegetables and kept a dairy bucket and managed a garden, which is to say it had been shaped by a whole agricultural world, not just by what was poured into it. It was not a standardized culture. It was a portrait of a place, drawn in living organisms, refined across 2 generations of bakers who fed it by feel and by smell and by the way it climbed the sides of the jar in the hour before sunrise on a warm morning. What Dr. Graydon's survey instrument could not measure was adaptability. A culture selected across 7 decades of variable conditions carries within it the genetic memory of every stress it has survived. A drought year that forced Vera to feed the culture rye instead of wheat did not kill it. It stressed it, and the community adapted, and the strains that could metabolize rye became more prevalent. And when the drought broke and the wheat came back, those strains receded, and the wheat-adapted strains returned, and the culture remembered both. A single-strain commercial culture has no such memory. Under stress, it fails. It fails consistently and predictably, which is one definition of reliability and another definition of fragility, depending on what the stress turns out to be. Colt had watched this happen in his food science courses without being told what he was watching. He had watched instructors describe the advantages of monoculture, production with the tone of settled science. He had nodded and taken notes. Now he stood in his grandmother's kitchen and understood that he had been learning the advantages of a particular kind of brittleness without anyone using that word. Vera died in October of 2020. She died quietly in the farmhouse, in the room where she had baked every Saturday morning for 50 years. There were no dramatic last words about the culture. She had said everything she needed to say about it over the course of a lifetime, and Colt had been paying attention, even when he had not known he was paying attention. The mason jar sat on the counter. He fed it that evening, not because he had made a decision, but because it needed feeding. He fed it the following morning. He kept feeding it twice a day, the way she had done, by feel and by smell, and the kitchen smelled on rising mornings the way the kitchen had always smelled on rising mornings, and that was enough to keep going. The bakeries had closed that spring, most of the small ones for good. The large regional operation in Omaha, where Colt had worked, kept its doors open with a skeleton crew and contracted out distribution. It reduced staff by 40% in May, bought 2 new automated shaping lines in June, and announced a partnership with a national grocery chain in the fall. The partnership required the bakery to standardize its product line further and eliminate 3 heritage-style items that did not fit the chain's SKU requirements. The production manager sent an email to staff describing this as an opportunity to streamline. It was doing what a large operation does when a structural shock arrives. It cut costs, standardized deeper, and moved faster toward the efficiency that had always been its theory of survival. Colt's neighbor, Dale Fuhr, had been running a small artisan bakery in Columbus, Nebraska for 11 years. Dale was a good baker, the kind who adjusted fermentation times by how the dough felt and kept a handwritten log of each batch going back to when he first opened. He had taken out a loan in 2018 to buy a deck oven and a walk-in proofer, financed over 7 years at 4.5%. The monthly payment ran $940. He had built a Wednesday morning farmers market account and a wholesale arrangement with 2 local restaurants and a boutique grocery on the main street of Columbus. He was pulling about $63,000 in annual revenue when the spring came, and his cost structure had been designed around that number. When the restaurants closed, he lost 30% of his revenue in a single week. When the farmers market suspended operations through the summer, he lost another 20. He applied for a small business relief loan in April and received an approval in September for 70% of what he requested. By August, he was paying his equipment loan from savings. By November, he was 3 months behind and had laid off his one part-time employee, a woman named Sandra, who had worked Friday mornings for 4 years and never missed a shift. Dale did not complain about this, at least not to Colt. He sat with it the way men who have been raised around farming sit with the losses, quietly, and with the particular dignity of someone who knows that blaming the weather is accurate and useless at the same time. Colt watched this from the farmhouse and drove over twice to sit with Dale and bring bread and say very little. He kept feeding the jar. If you have ever wondered whether this kind of thing still matters, whether one kitchen and one jar and one person's patience can mean anything against the scale of a market that moves by the container load, I would ask you to stay with this story a little longer, because the answer is in the number, and the number is still ahead of us. The first thing Colt did in 2021 was get certified. He had read the cottage food pamphlet Dr. Graydon left 3 times over the winter, and then set it aside and gone to the Nebraska Department of Agriculture's website and read everything available about food entrepreneurship licensing from first principles, without the pamphlet's framing, to understand what was actually required rather than what the pamphlet thought he would need. He filed for a cottage food permit in January. He registered as a sole proprietorship in February, called it Reimer Culture, and opened a business checking account with $42. He sourced 100 pounds of whole-grain red winter wheat from a farm 8 miles from the house. A man named Hector Strand, who had been growing heritage varieties on the same ground for 30 years and selling most of it to commodity buyers who mixed it into pools where its particular characteristics vanished into the average. Hector had never been asked to sell 100 pounds to someone who intended to mill it himself. He looked at Colt for a moment and then said he supposed 100 pounds was 100 pounds, and cut him a deal. Colt milled it on a stone burr mill he had found at an estate sale in Schuyler, and rebuilt over 3 weekends in the garage, replacing a cracked runner stone with one he had sourced from a mill restoration company in Ohio. He adjusted the gap between the stones until the flour came out, at a granularity he could feel with his fingers, and that matched the texture his grandmother had described in a note tucked into the back of her recipe box. Fine enough to catch in the crease of your palm, but coarse enough to show color. The flour was a pale gold with visible bran flecks, and it smelled of grain and earth in a way that the commodity flour from the grocery store had never smelled. He baked 12 loaves in the farmhouse oven, using the culture fed twice daily for 72 hours as the sole leavening. The loaves came out with a deep mahogany crust that crackled when it cooled, and an open, irregular crumb that caught the light in a way that even-textured commercial bread did not. He drove them to a table in the Platte County Agricultural Building parking lot on a Saturday in March, a card table with a cloth his grandmother had embroidered, and sold all 12 in 40 minutes. A woman named Loretta Schindler, who ran the county's small business development office out of a suite on the second floor of the courthouse, bought 2 loaves and came back 20 minutes later with a friend who bought 2 more and a question about when the next batch would be available. He told her he wasn't sure. She said she thought he should be sure and handed him her card. Colt called her the following week at Loretta's request and sat across from her desk in the courthouse and answered questions for 45 minutes about his costs, his capacity, his production timeline, and his plans. He answered the first 3 questions in concrete numbers. He stumbled on the 4th. Colt had not intended to build a business. He had intended to keep the starter alive and to bake the bread that the starter wanted to produce. The distinction mattered to him in a way he could not fully articulate, though he tried once at that table in Loretta's office when she pushed him to describe his growth plan. He said he did not have a growth plan. He said he had a dough that had been alive in one form or another since 1953, and that he was trying to understand what it wanted to be in his hands, the way his grandmother had understood what it wanted to be in hers. He said that understanding took time, and that rushing it would produce a different thing than the thing he was trying to protect. Loretta looked at him for a long moment over her reading glasses and said that was either very wise or very impractical, and possibly both. She was right on both counts. She was also, as it turned out, the person who connected him to the church hall rental in September, who put his name on the county's food entrepreneur newsletter, and who drove to Columbus in December and pressed Dale Fuhr to visit the farmhouse kitchen and taste the bread for himself. What Colt had, which no growth plan can manufacture, was a product that did something a commercial starter cannot do. Because the culture was broadly diverse, carrying dozens of yeast strains and a deep lactobacillus community, the bread it produced was more complex in flavor than any bread a single-strain starter could produce. The fermentation acids, primarily lactic and acetic, developed at a ratio shaped by the particular microbial balance of the culture. And that ratio was characteristic, meaning it was the same ratio every time, not because it was standardized, but because the community had reached a stable equilibrium in the conditions of that kitchen. The bread tasted like something with a specific address. Bakers who tried to replicate it with commercial starters could not replicate it. The flavor was not a technique, it was an ecology. Word moved the way word moves in counties where people talk to each other. By June of 2021, Colt was baking on Tuesdays and Thursdays in addition to Saturdays. By September, he had applied for an upgrade to a commercial kitchen license and was baking in the church hall 3 days a week, paying rent in bread. By December, he had a mailing list of 211 people who wanted to know when he would begin selling starter cultures directly. He had been considering it since autumn, but not for the reason most people assumed. Let me tell you what a healthy sourdough culture does when it is regularly divided and fed. Each time you remove a portion of a living starter and feed it fresh flour and water, you stimulate the remaining culture to ferment actively, restoring its population density and refreshing the balance of strains within its community. The act of giving some away is the act of keeping it healthy. Vera had known this. She had pressed portions on neighbors and friends for 30 years, not out of generosity alone, though she was generous, but because sharing the culture was part of its care. A starter that is never divided becomes sluggish. A starter that is shared stays vigorous. Colt understood this mechanism now in both the scientific terms his degree gave him and in the plain observational terms his grandmother had always used without naming them. He understood that the best thing he could do for the culture in the long run was to send it into other kitchens, other microbial environments, other hands, and let it adapt. He understood that each person who kept the culture and fed it and baked with it would become a node in a network that the culture itself would inhabit, shifting slightly in each kitchen to meet local conditions while maintaining the core community that 67 years of Platte County selection had built. He spent the fall of 2021 developing a shipping protocol. The challenge was not refrigeration. A healthy sourdough culture in an active state with sufficient flour reserves can survive 48 hours in a sealed container at ambient temperature without permanent harm, provided the container allows some gas exchange and the culture was vigorous before packing. The challenge was documentation. He needed to know what to tell the person opening the package, how to explain the feeding schedule in terms that a beginner could follow, how to communicate the difference between a culture that was adjusting to a new kitchen and one that was genuinely struggling, and how to build confidence in people who had never kept a living food before. He contacted a food science professor at the University of Nebraska, a woman named Dr. Ana Chavez, who specialized in fermented food microbiology and had published work on wild culture diversity in artisan food production. He asked her to help him characterize the culture, not to standardize it, but to understand what was in it, to give him the scientific vocabulary, to describe what his grandmother had always described by feel. Dr. Chavez drove to the farmhouse in October, walked through the kitchen, asked Colt how long the culture had been maintained on site, and took samples. She drove back 3 weeks later with a preliminary analysis. She identified 38 distinct microbial strains, including 4 wild yeast species and a lactobacillus population more diverse than any she had previously characterized in a non-industrial culture from the Central Plains. The dominant yeast species was Kazakhstania humilis, which she said was characteristic of European-descended sourdough traditions, and more tolerant of acid stress than the Saccharomyces cerevisiae used in commercial production. The lactobacillus community included strains associated with slow, cold fermentation, strains that performed best in dry conditions, and at least 2 strains she could not match to any documented species in the database, which she described with visible interest as an unusual finding. She said the culture was, by any technical standard, exceptional. She said she wanted to write a paper about it. Colt said she was welcome to do that. She asked if he understood what he had. He said he thought he was starting to. She left the farmhouse and drove back to Lincoln along the county road, and Colt stood in the kitchen with her preliminary report on the table and the jar on the counter and understood something he had been circling for a year. What Dr. Graydon had measured and what Dr. Chavez had measured were the same jar, and they had reached opposite conclusions, not because one of them was wrong as a scientist, but because they had used different questions to approach the same object. Dr. Graydon had asked what it could be sold as. Dr. Chavez had asked what it was. They were not the same question. Dr. Graydon came back in the spring of 2022. He drove the same white pickup. His boots were still clean. He had read Dr. Chavez's preliminary analysis, which had circulated through the university's extension network with enough velocity that his department chair had forwarded it to him with a 2-word note: Platte County. Phil Graydon understood the note immediately. He had not enjoyed understanding it. He stood in Colt's commercial kitchen at the church hall, which was certified and logged and equipped with the documentation that Dr. Graydon's own frameworks required, and he looked at the certified scales, the regulated temperature logs, the traceability records for every batch going back 14 months, and said that he owed Colt an apology. Colt handed him a slice of bread. "I told you it was a sentimental artifact," Dr. Graydon said. He said it plainly, without excess. He was a precise man. "You did," Colt said. "I was measuring the wrong thing." He held the bread in both hands for a moment before he ate it, the way you hold something when you are trying to understand it before you consume it. "I was measuring what I knew how to certify. That's not the same as measuring what's actually there." Colt nodded. He did not say anything else, and this was deliberate, not because he was being cold, but because the moment did not require anything else from him. He cut another slice and set it on the counter between them, and Dr. Graydon ate it and went quiet, the way people go quiet when something tastes like more than technique. After a long moment, he set the rest of the slice down and asked Colt if he would be willing to speak with some of the extension staff, not to defend anything, but to walk through what he had learned about the culture and how it responded to different conditions. Colt said he would consider it. He did not say yes immediately. He thought about it for 2 weeks and then said yes and drove to Lincoln in April and spent an afternoon with 7 extension agents and Dr. Chavez in a conference room, showing them the feeding logs and the traceability documentation and explaining, in the plain language he had used in his feeding guide, how a diverse microbial community behaved differently under stress than a monoculture did. Dr. Graydon asked 3 questions. All 3 were good ones. At the end, he said he thought the Extension Service had been missing a category and that they would need to develop one. That was the last time Dr. Graydon called the culture a sentimental artifact, because he had stopped believing it was one. Dale Four had sold his deck oven in January of 2022. He had sold the proofer in March and paid the last 6 months of his loan, and closed the bakery in April. He was working maintenance at the county hospital. Colt had driven over to Columbus the day Dale signed the paperwork and sat with him at the kitchen table. He did not offer advice. He brought 2 loaves of bread and left them on the counter, and Dale thanked him, and that was most of what was said. The structural shock had not cared about Dale's skill. Dale was a skilled baker. The shock had cared about the loans he carried, the revenue lines he depended on, and the fact that his operation was a single-threaded bet on a specific channel of commerce that had closed without warning. The shock was impersonal. It did not distinguish between good bakers and bad ones. It distinguished between operations that could absorb a sudden stop and operations that could not. Colt could absorb the stop because there was nothing to stop. The farmhouse had no debt. The starter had no overhead. The church hall rental was paid in bread, and bread required only flour and water and time. When the world closed, he had continued to feed the jar and to bake the bread and to sell what he baked from the trunk of his truck and at a table in a parking lot. His costs were flour, water, salt, and the electricity to heat the oven. His inventory was alive and self-replenishing. His product was a thing that no industrial operation had made a market for, precisely because no industrial operation could produce it. His nephew, Marcus, came home from the University of Nebraska in the spring of 2023. Marcus was 23, had a degree in agricultural business with a concentration in supply chain management, had been offered a position with a regional grain cooperative in Lincoln at a starting salary of $52,000, and was spending the summer at the farmhouse before starting work in September. He was a practical young man, not unkind, with the forward-leaning energy of someone who had just finished 4 years of being told that the future belonged to people who could read markets efficiently. He had grown up eating Colt's bread and Vera's before it, and he had spent the summer of his junior year interning with a commodity grain broker in Omaha and coming home on weekends with the distracted look of someone whose brain was still running calculations. He was polite about the bread. He was puzzled about the business. He spent the first 2 weeks of June helping with the farmhouse maintenance, going to the farmer's market on Saturdays, and watching Colt's operation with the careful attention of someone constructing an analysis he had not yet shared. Then, one evening, on the porch, with the fields going orange in the late light, he shared it. He said Colt was leaving money on the table by not expanding. He said this carefully, not dismissively. He said he had been working through the numbers. Colt asked him what he would expand to. Marcus said a regional distribution arrangement, cold chain packaging, and a direct-to-consumer subscription model would let Colt produce starter culture at meaningful volume and reach home bakers across the Midwest and beyond. He said the artisan food market had been growing at 11% annually for 3 consecutive years, and that doctor, Chavez's paper, which Marcus had read and thought was genuinely compelling, gave Colt a scientific credibility that most artisan food producers would pay heavily to manufacture. He said the mailing list alone, which by then had grown to over 1,400 people, was a marketing asset that most small food businesses spent years trying to build. Colt said the culture would change under that kind of pressure. Marcus said all businesses changed under pressure, and that most of them survived it. Colt said he meant the culture itself, the living one in the jar on the counter in the kitchen. He said that a culture propagated and shipped in industrial quantities under standardized conditions would, over time, select for the strains that could tolerate industrial propagation and standardized shipping. Those strains were not the strains that gave the bread its particular character. The Platte County character of the culture was the product of the Platte County conditions of its care, and industrial production would impose different conditions, and the culture would respond to those conditions the way it always responded, by adapting, by becoming something suited to where it now lived. It would still be a good culture. It would no longer be this culture. Marcus thought about that for a long time, staring out at the fields. Then he said quietly that it sounded like the thing that made it worth selling was the same thing that made it impossible to sell the way he was describing. Colt said that was about right. Marcus sat with this for several minutes in a way that was different from someone dismissing it. He was not dismissing it. He was genuinely trying to find a counter-argument and coming up short, and the experience of coming up short against a line of reasoning that felt right even though it contradicted 4 years of training was one he had not encountered often. He took a piece of bread from the plate between them and ate it, and looked out at the fields and said nothing for a long time. He came back the following weekend and the one after that. In July, he began asking about the feeding schedule, the way you ask about something when you are considering whether to take it on rather than simply wondering about it. In August, he deferred his start date at the grain cooperative. In September, he called their HR contact and said he would not be coming after all, and spent 3 days sitting with the discomfort of a decision that could not be backed out of, and that he had made for reasons he could not fully explain to his mother, who called twice. He explained it, finally, by saying that he had tasted the bread and done the math, and that the math eventually pointed somewhere the numbers did not go. The protocol Colt had developed for shipping live starter cultures was meticulous. Each portion was propagated in the farmhouse kitchen, fed twice daily for 72 hours before shipment, packed in a sterile, food-grade container with a perforated lid, nestled in insulated packaging with a printed feeding guide that Colt had written and revised 17 times before he was satisfied that it could be understood by someone who had never baked sourdough. The guide explained the science of the culture in plain language. It described what the organisms were, why they needed flour and water at regular intervals, how to read the rise and fall of the starter as a sign of health, how to smell the difference between a culture that was thriving and one that had been stressed. He explained that the culture would adapt slightly to each new kitchen, and that this adaptation was not a flaw but a continuation of what the culture had always done. He launched the first mail order batch in November of 2022. He produced 40 portions. He announced them to his mailing list of 612 people. He sold all 40 in 11 hours. He produced 60 portions in December. He sold them in 6 hours. In January of 2023, he brought Marcus into the operation formally. Not as a business manager, but as a second feeder and baker, someone to carry the twice-daily care when Colt drove to Columbus for supplies or attended the farmers market in Omaha that had invited him as a featured vendor in the spring. The operation was 2 people and a jar. That was enough, and Colt intended for it to stay enough. He pressed Marcus on this more than once. He said that the size of the operation was not an accident or a constraint. It was a decision. The same kind of decision his grandmother had made every time she had pressed a portion of starter on a neighbor rather than trying to sell it. He said the right size of the thing was the size at which the culture could be cared for with the attention it required, and that size was not a function of market demand. Market demand could go anywhere. The culture could only go where it was properly tended. Marcus understood this differently each time he heard it. By the 3rd time, he understood it the way you understand something when it stops being an argument and starts being a fact. The waiting list opened in January of 2024 and drew 1,432 names in 6 days. The list closed in 4. Colt read the number to Marcus on a Friday morning in the farmhouse kitchen, standing at the counter where the jar sat, which was not Vera's mason jar, but one of the same type, purchased new and washed in cold water and no soap. The culture inside it descended without interruption from the culture Vera had received from her mother in 1948. 1,432 people who wanted a piece of this particular living thing, this specific ecology of wild organisms that had been shaped by one county's water and grain and seasonal weather across 7 decades and 2 women's hands before his. Marcus asked how many they were going to ship. Colt said 120. He said they would open the list again in 3 months, ship another 120, and continue at that pace for as long as the culture remained what it was. Marcus asked what happened to the rest of the list. Colt said they waited. He said people who understood what they were waiting for would wait. People who didn't would find something else, and that was fine too. Dr. Chavez's paper had been published in a food science journal the previous fall, and a long article about the culture had appeared in a regional food magazine in December, and a food editor at a national publication had reached out to ask about a piece. Colt had given one interview to a woman from Nebraska Public Radio and had declined the rest. He said he was a baker, not a story. The radio interviewer had asked whether it bothered him that Dr. Graydon had called the culture sentimental, and Colt had said no, that it didn't bother him at all, that Dr. Graydon had been working with the instruments his training gave him, and that those instruments couldn't see what they couldn't see. He said that was not a fault of the man, but a fact about the instruments. Doctor. Graydon had sent a letter in the spring of 2023, a handwritten one, 2 pages, in which he said that he had been thinking about the visit to the farmhouse kitchen in 2020 and had come to believe his assessment had been a category error. He said he had been evaluating the culture as a commercial product when he should have been evaluating it as a biological community, and that those were different standards of analysis that produced different conclusions. He said he appreciated that Colt had not taken the pamphlet personally. He said he had begun keeping a sourdough starter of his own. Colt wrote back a short note and included a feeding schedule. By the spring of 2024, 17 of the people who had received starter cultures in the first mail-order batch of November 2022 had sent Colt letters or emails describing what had happened in their kitchens. A woman in Bozeman, Montana, reported that her culture had taken on a slight tang she associated with the rye flour grown in her valley. A man in eastern Tennessee said his culture was producing a bread with a flavor different from what he had baked the first month, deeper and more complex, and he wanted to know if that was right. Colt wrote back to the woman in Montana and told her that the adaptation was the culture doing what it had always done, selecting for strains suited to her kitchen's particular conditions, and that what she was tasting was the beginning of a new character developing in the place where she lived. He wrote back to the man in Tennessee and said the same thing. He was not building a product. He was extending a community of organisms into new environments, and those organisms were doing what organisms do. They were learning the ground beneath them. Marcus drove down to Columbus in February of 2024 and sat with Dale Fuhr for an afternoon. He came back and told Colt that Dale was thinking about getting back into baking. Smaller this time, no loans, a permit, and a home oven and a table at the Saturday market. Marcus said Dale had asked about getting a portion of the starter. Colt said to tell Dale it was waiting for him whenever he was ready. He packed a jar the following week and drove it over himself. He sat at Dale's table and drank coffee and explained the feeding schedule, which Dale listened to with the patience of someone who had spent 11 years listening to dough. When Colt got up to leave, Dale held the jar in both hands and looked at it the way you look at something that costs more than money can cover. "Your grandmother fed this thing through the drought year," Dale said. Colt said she had. Dale set the jar carefully on the counter and said he would try to be worthy of it. There is a mason jar on the counter of the farmhouse kitchen in Platte County that has been alive in one vessel or another since a woman crossed the Missouri River with a crock of starter tucked in a flour sack in 1948. The jar has not changed. The counter has not changed. The water is the same well water it has always been, drawn from the same aquifer that the red winter wheat growing 8 miles away draws from. And that fact is not coincidental. The culture knows the water. The water is part of what the culture is. What Dr. Graydon's form could not record was the 70-year conversation between this particular living community and this particular piece of ground. You cannot put a conversation on a survey instrument. You cannot standardize a relationship between organisms and the minerals dissolved in one county's well water. You cannot ship the ecology of a place in a climate-controlled container with a standardized microbial profile, because what you would be shipping would no longer be the ecology of that place. It would be something else, reliable and certified, and built to travel at industrial scale, and empty of the specific history that made the thing worth having. What Colt understood, and what took him 3 years of feeding twice daily, and milling his own flour and sleeping in the farmhouse that had shaped the culture to understand fully, is that the value was not in the recipe. It was not in the technique. It was in the continuity, the unbroken chain of care that ran from a woman on a steamboat in 1948 to his grandmother's hands to his own, each link forged by the specific conditions of one place and the attention of people who had learned to read that place without ever writing their knowledge down as anything other than practice. The world measures what it can count. It counts the number of strains it has identified and the commercial market share and the regulatory classifications and the cottage food exemption thresholds. It counted them all and saw a biological artifact of primarily sentimental value. It could not count the 70 years of selection pressure that had turned one immigrant's crock of starter into a community of organisms more diverse and adaptive than anything an industrial fermentation laboratory had produced on purpose. What is patient outlasts what is fast. What is diverse outlasts what is uniform. What is specific to a place outlasts what is scalable away from it. These are not sentiments. They are the plain findings of the biology, if you let the biology run long enough to return its verdict. On the counter of a farmhouse in Platte County, Nebraska, the jar breathes. Marcus will feed it this evening, the way Colt taught him, the way Vera taught Colt without knowing she was teaching anything at all. The red winter wheat from 8 miles away will go in, and the well water, and the lid will go back on. And by morning the culture will have risen, and the room will smell the way that room has smelled on rising mornings since before either of them was born. That smell is the answer to every question a survey form was not built to ask.